Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories. How are you and your family today? I'd love to hear from you. Today, I have an incredible story for you, one that will take you on a thrilling journey of power, loss, redemption, and love. Imagine this: a billionaire, blinded by his confidence and wealth, makes a reckless bet, only to lose everything: his fortune, his empire, and even his beloved wife. But what happens next will shock you and touch your heart in ways you never expected. Are you ready for this emotional roller coaster? If you love thrilling, emotional, and life-changing stories, don't forget to subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you. More suspense, heartwarming lessons, and unforgettable journeys are coming your way. Stay tuned. Richard Langston was the kind of man who made people pause when he entered a room. His presence wasn't just about his tailored suits or the unmistakable scent of wealth that followed him. It was the way he carried himself. Confident, powerful, and utterly untouchable. He wasn't born into wealth. No silver spoon, no inheritance. He had clawed his way to the top, turning small investments into an empire. Now, he was one of the richest men in the country, a name spoken with admiration in corporate circles and whispered with envy by those who had once doubted him. Richard owned everything a man could dream of: skyscrapers bearing his name, luxury cars worth more than most people's homes, a private jet that could take him anywhere at a moment's notice. He dined at the finest restaurants, traveled to the most exotic locations, and lived in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline like a king surveying his kingdom. And then there was Isabella. His wife was not just beautiful, she was breathtaking, a woman whose elegance made heads turn, whose mere presence could silence a room. Long, dark waves of hair cascaded down her back, and her golden brown eyes held a depth that Richard often ignored. She was not just his wife, she was his most prized possession, the one thing in his life that added a touch of warmth to his otherwise calculated existence. But to Richard, love had always been a transaction. He showered Isabella with diamonds, designer dresses, and trips to Paris on a whim. He never considered that she might have wanted something different, something money couldn't buy. Because Richard Langston believed one thing above all else: everything has a price. Power was Richard's greatest addiction. He thrived on the fear in his employees' eyes, the desperate need for his approval from business partners, the way the world seemed to bend to his will. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a force. Every day, newspapers printed his name. Langston Enterprises hits record-breaking profits. Richard Langston, the man who turns everything to gold. He reveled in it. To him, wealth wasn't just about luxury, it was about control. He controlled the markets, the deals, and the people around him. When he walked into a room, men straightened their ties, women adjusted their posture, and conversations shifted to accommodate his presence. He had built a world where he always won. And in this world, love was just another thing to be owned. Isabella had tried to make him see it before. One evening, as they lounged on the deck of their private yacht, she looked at him with eyes that held an emotion he didn't recognize: sadness. "Richard," she murmured, "do you ever wonder what life would be like if we didn't have all this?" She gestured to the endless ocean around them, the golden glow of the sunset reflecting off the water. He chuckled, sipping his whiskey. "Why would I wonder about that? We worked for this, Isabella. We earned it." She sighed. "But what if we lost it all? What if tomorrow the money was gone? Would we still be us?" Richard scoffed. That would never happen. And that was the problem. He was so certain, so arrogant, that he never even considered the possibility of losing. But Isabella knew better. She had always known that no empire is untouchable, no man is invincible. She had warned him time and time again. "Richard," she whispered one night as they lay in their king-sized bed, her voice barely above a breath. "One day you're going to make a mistake, and when that day comes, you'll realize that some things can't be bought back." He smirked in the darkness, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "I never lose, darling." But Isabella closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek, because deep down she knew something Richard didn't. Everything comes at a cost, and soon he would pay the ultimate price. The air inside the Orion Casino was thick with the scent of wealth and indulgence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting off the polished marble floors. The murmur of high-stakes gambling, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of laughter created an intoxicating atmosphere. This was not just any casino, it was a sanctuary for the elite, a playground where billionaires toyed with fate, throwing around fortunes as if they were mere pocket change. And in the center of it all, Richard Langston reigned supreme. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, Richard lounged in the VIP section, his fingers lazily swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He was surrounded by men who, like him, lived for power: CEOs, oil tycoons, real estate moguls. They talked about their latest acquisitions, their most extravagant purchases, their insatiable hunger for more. Richard thrived in this world. Here, he was not just a man, he was a legend. Yet as the night wore on, another presence emerged from the shadows, a man unlike the rest. The first thing people noticed about Victor Mercer was his smile, cold, knowing, and entirely devoid of warmth. He was not just rich, he was dangerous. A self-made billionaire with a reputation for ruthless business tactics, Victor was feared in circles where even the wealthiest men treaded carefully. Unlike Richard, Victor did not crave attention. He did not need to be the loudest voice in the room. Power dripped from him in silence. That night, Victor had been watching Richard, studying him, waiting. And when Richard laughed a little too loudly, boasted a little too carelessly, Victor saw his opening. "You really think money makes you invincible?" Victor's voice was smooth, laced with a quiet challenge as he leaned back in his seat, a glass of aged scotch resting in his hand. Richard turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" Victor smirked. "I've watched you all night. You believe you're untouchable, that your wealth makes you immune to real risk." He took a slow sip of his drink. "But tell me, Richard, when was the last time you truly gambled?" Richard chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Every day is a gamble in my world. Business, investments, stocks. It's all a game of risk and reward." Victor tilted his head slightly, eyes gleaming. No. That's calculated risk. That's playing with a safety net. I'm talking about real stakes, something that actually matters." A hush fell over the group. The challenge had been set. Richard smirked, arrogance dripping from his voice. "I could bet anything and still win." Victor leaned forward, his fingers tapping against his glass. "Then bet something valuable." The whiskey burned in Richard's throat, but his pride burned hotter. He was being tested, doubted, and Richard Langston never backed down from a challenge. He grabbed a pen from the dealer's table and yanked a napkin from beneath his drink. His hand moved fast, the ink flowing like poison. His terms were simple, reckless, insane. If he lost, he would sign over his entire empire, every business, every property, every asset. And more than that, he would let Isabella go. Forever. Victor's eyes darkened with something unreadable as he watched Richard sign. A silent predator watching his prey step willingly into the trap. "Are you sure about this?" one of the other billionaires murmured, shifting uneasily in his seat. Richard laughed, sliding the napkin across the table. "I never lose." Victor picked up the napkin, studying the words. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, He signed beneath Richard's name. The deal was sealed. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a warning. But Richard was too drunk on whiskey and arrogance to listen. The game was simple. A single round of poker. One hand. One moment to decide the fate of an empire, a marriage, a life. The cards were dealt. Richard leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence as he glanced at his hand. Ace, king, a near-perfect start. Victor, on the other hand, remained unreadable, his expression unchanged, his movements slow, methodical. The betting began. Chips piled high, millions thrown into the center without hesitation. The air in the room grew thick, tense. The other billionaires watched in silence, aware that they were witnessing something historic. Richard's pulse thrummed in his ears as he stared at Victor. He was bluffing. He had to be. When the final card was revealed, Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. A straight flush. Victor won. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. For the first time in his life, Richard Langston felt something he had never known before. Fear. He looked at Victor, expecting a smirk, a taunt, but there was only calm certainty. You... Richard's voice came out in a whisper. You set this up. Victor leaned forward, his voice low and merciless. No, Richard. You set this up. I simply waited. The weight of what he had done crushed down on him. His empire, his fortune, Isabella. Gone. He turned, desperate, searching for something. An escape, a loophole, anything. But Victor only pushed the napkin back toward him. Be a man of your word. And just like that, Richard Langston lost everything. Stumbling out of the casino, Richard's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. His vision blurred as he dialed Isabella's number. She answered on the first ring. Richard? His throat was dry. I lost. A pause. A long, excruciating silence. Then, softly, lost what? He closed his eyes. Everything. The company. The money. He hesitated, his voice breaking. And you? A sharp inhale, a moment of pure devastation. Then in the quietest, most heartbreaking voice he had ever heard, she whispered, How could you? And before he could say anything else, the line went dead. That night, Richard Langston didn't just lose his fortune. He lost the one thing that truly mattered, and for the first time in his life, he had no way to buy it back. The world blurred around Richard Langston as the cards were dealt. The glittering chandeliers overhead seemed dimmer, the murmurs of the high-stakes casino distant, like echoes in a dream he couldn't control. He held his breath, his fingers resting against the cool green of the poker table. This was it. One hand, one moment, one decision that would define his fate. He had always believed in his own luck, his own invincibility. Money had never failed him. He had gambled in boardrooms, played with billion-dollar deals like they were child's toys, and always walked away victorious. Tonight would be no different. At least, that's what he told himself. But as the cards fell, something inside him twisted. Something was wrong. Victor sat across from him, a man carved from stone. His eyes were sharp, unreadable, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His fingers tapped lightly on the table as the dealer revealed the first round of cards. Richard inhaled slowly. Ace. King. A promising start. He smirked. His confidence returned, washing away the small tremor of doubt. He had played hundreds of hands in his life, but never had the stakes been this high. His empire, his fortune, his marriage, all resting on the turn of a card. And yet, he felt no fear, only the thrill of knowing he would win. The game played out in slow motion. The dealer flipped the next set of cards. Richard barely glanced at them. His focus was on Victor. The man was impossible to read. He never flinched, never hesitated. His movements were precise, as if he knew the outcome long before the game had begun. Richard scoffed internally. It's a bluff. It has to be. With every round, the pot grew larger. Millions. Tens of millions. The air in the casino thickened, the whispers of the other billionaires fading into white noise. Victor raised the stakes again, sliding a mountain of chips forward. Richard grinned, mirroring the gesture, matching it, raising it, doubling it. The room held its breath. And then, the final card. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs as the dealer turned it over. It took him 3 full seconds to register what he was seeing. The color drained from his face. Victor's lips curled into the slowest, most dangerous smirk Richard had ever seen. A straight flush. Richard's stomach dropped. His throat tightened. The weight of what had just happened slammed into him with a force that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. He had lost. The world around him stopped. He could hear the faint hum of the casino floor beyond the VIP section, the distant sound of a woman's laughter, the clinking of glasses. But at this table, silence. A slow, deliberate movement. Victor reached forward, his fingers sliding across the table, picking up the napkin, the reckless contract Richard had signed in a haze of whiskey and arrogance. A contract that now belonged to him. A bet is a bet, Richard. Victor's voice was calm, almost amused, but beneath it there was something darker. Something that sent a chill down Richard's spine, a whisper of finality. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands were cold, his vision blurred. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his world, his kingdom. And yet, in a single moment, everything was gone. "Wait," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "We can renegotiate." Victor exhaled a small chuckle, shaking his head. "There's no renegotiating fate." Richard's stomach twisted. "But—" Victor stood, sliding the contract into his inner pocket, his movement slow and deliberate. In control. "I'll be taking your empire now," he murmured. His gaze flickered toward Richard. "And your wife." The words hit Richard like a gunshot. He shot up from his seat. "Isabella has nothing to do with this." Victor arched an eyebrow. "Doesn't she?" He tapped his pocket, where the contract lay folded. "You bet her, Richard, just like you bet your money, just like you bet everything else." Richard's breath came in short, sharp gasps. "What have I done?" His mind raced, desperately clawing for a way out. But there was none, because he had signed it all away, and Victor was a man who never lost. The other billionaires at the table sat frozen, unsure whether to pity Richard or fear Victor. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered, "Jesus Christ." But no one spoke up, because no one crossed Victor Mercer. Richard felt the weight of their stares, once filled with admiration, now laced with something else. Disbelief, pity. He had walked into this room a king, a ruler, untouchable. Now he was nothing. Richard Langston, the billionaire mogul who had once dictated the fate of industries, stumbled out of the casino like a broken man. His hands shook. His breath came in uneven gasps. He fumbled for his phone, his mind screaming at him to fix this. He dialed Isabella's number. She picked up immediately. "Richard?" His throat tightened at the sound of her voice. Soft, warm, the only thing in his life that had ever truly mattered. And now he had lost her. He swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I lost." A silence stretched between them. He could hear her breathing, hear the way it suddenly hitched. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Lost what?" He closed his eyes. Everything. The silence deepened, turned heavier, colder. Then, barely above a breath, "How could you?" Richard felt his chest cave in. The line went dead. For the first time in his life, he had truly lost. And there was no price he could pay to get it back. The billionaire who once believed he was invincible now stood alone, staring at his own reflection in a casino mirror. His eyes were hollow. His hands trembled. Everything he had built, Everything he had loved, destroyed by his own arrogance. And for the first time in his life, Richard Langston felt something he had never known before: regret. The grand penthouse was bathed in the golden glow of the city lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, offering a breathtaking view of New York, a city that never slept, much like Isabella Langston that night. She stood by the window, wrapped in a silk robe, a glass of wine untouched on the coffee table beside her. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. Richard was late. Again. She had been waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to call, waiting for the man she loved to prove that he still loved her too. But tonight, instead of Richard walking through the door with his usual arrogant smirk and a half-hearted apology, her phone rang, and with one phone call, her entire world shattered. When she answered, she knew something was wrong. Richard's voice wasn't its usual confident, self-assured tone. Instead, it was hollow, defeated. "I lost," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran down her spine. "Lost what?" A pause. A silence so heavy it made her stomach twist. Then his next words hit her like a knife to the chest. "Everything." Her breath caught. "Richard, what do you mean?" Another silence. And then his voice cracked, raw and pained. "I bet the company, the fortune, and—" The hesitation in his voice made her heart pound. She felt her fingers tremble against the phone. "And?" she pressed, a lump forming in her throat, a sharp inhale from the other end. "Then you." Isabella's breath hitched. She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it as if it were a viper that had just bitten her. He wouldn't. He couldn't. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, laced with disbelief. "Tell me you're lying." Silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Richard," she choked out, her voice barely holding together. "Tell me you did not gamble me away." He paused, and that hesitation was all the confirmation she needed. A tear slid down her cheek, burning like acid. Her voice wavered. "You bet me, Richard." Was I just another asset to you? She had always known Richard was reckless, arrogant, addicted to risk. But she had never imagined that he would see her as something to be gambled away like one of his luxury cars or penthouses. Her fingers clenched into a fist. "I was your wife, Richard." Her voice was raw, trembling with fury and heartbreak. "Not a business deal, not some property you could trade." He stammered, "Isabella, She shook her head. Stop. She didn't want to hear his excuses. She had spent years making excuses for him, forgiving his flaws, looking past his arrogance because deep down she had believed that somewhere beneath that invincible billionaire exterior there was a man who truly loved her. But now, she wasn't sure that man even existed. She wiped at her tears angrily. She didn't want to cry, not for him. Love was supposed to be a promise, a sanctuary, a place of trust, not a damn poker chip. She forced a deep breath. "Love isn't a gamble, Richard." Her voice was quiet now, yet the weight of her words carried more force than any scream. And then, with one final whisper, she shattered his world the way he had shattered hers. "You lost me the moment you thought it was." She hung up. And with that, she walked away. Her legs trembled as she moved, each step feeling heavier than the last. She made it to their bedroom, the place where they had shared their happiest moments, their whispered secrets, their late-night laughter. And now, it felt like a graveyard of broken promises. She pulled open the closet doors, her fingers shaking as she reached for her suitcase. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stay. Not after this. Not after realizing that the man she had loved for years had seen her as nothing more than a piece in his twisted game. She stuffed clothes into her bag, mindlessly, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her wedding ring, the symbol of their love, glimmered under the bedside lamp. She stared at it for a moment, a war raging inside her. Then, with a deep breath, she slid it off and placed it gently on the nightstand. She was done. The sun had barely risen when Isabella walked out of the penthouse, a single suitcase rolling behind her. Her heart ached with every step, but she didn't turn back. Not once. The doorman gave her a hesitant smile. "Going on a trip, Mrs. Langston?" She forced a small smile, though the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "No," she said softly. "I'm going home." The words felt strange on her tongue, because for the past 5 years, Richard had been her home, but not anymore. She hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat as the driver asked, "Where to, ma'am?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Anywhere but here." As the car pulled away, Isabella allowed herself one final glance at the life she was leaving behind. And for the first time in years, she realized she wasn't losing anything. Richard was the one who had lost, and it was a loss he would never recover from. Somewhere in a dark casino, Richard Langston sat alone, staring at the phone in his trembling hands. Her last words echoed in his mind, haunting him. "You lost me the moment you thought love was a gamble." He had been a king, a ruler, a man who had everything. Now, he was nothing. And the worst part? No amount of money could buy back what he had just lost. Not this time. Richard Langston woke up to the sound of knocking. No, pounding. His head throbbed, the after-effects of last night's alcohol mixing with the bitter taste of regret. He groaned, pushing himself up from the massive bed in his penthouse. Everything felt off. The room was colder, the sheets felt unfamiliar. And then, the pounding again. "Mr. Langston, open up!" The voice was sharp, authoritative. "Security." His heart lurched. Why the hell were his own security guards banging on his door like they were about to throw him out? Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Richard swung his legs over the bed, rubbing his temples. His mind was foggy, the weight of last night pressing down on him. The game, the cards, Victor's smirk. "A bet is a bet, Richard." His breath caught. His eyes snapped open fully. Number no, no, no. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone on the nightstand. He pressed the fingerprint sensor. Nothing. The screen blinked. Access denied. His stomach twisted. Something was wrong. He jumped out of bed, moving toward the closet, but the pounding on the door grew louder. "Mr. Langston, open the door or we'll open it for you." His hands fumbled with the knob. He yanked the door open, expecting to see his usual security team standing there, ready to take orders. But what he saw instead terrified him. 3 massive security guards stood in the hallway, their faces cold, detached. But they weren't alone. Behind them stood a lawyer, Victor's lawyer, a man in a crisp black suit, holding a folder in his hands. "Richard Langston," the lawyer said smoothly, stepping forward. "As of this morning, all of your assets have been transferred to Victor Mercer, per the terms of the contract you signed last night." Richard's vision blurred. This isn't happening." His mouth went dry. This is a joke." The lawyer's expression didn't change. "Your private accounts are frozen. Your company no longer belongs to you. Your home, your properties, your vehicles." He flipped a page in the folder. "They are all now under Mr. Mercer's control." Richard's heartbeat roared in his ears. His fingers clenched into fists. "This is my house," he growled. "You can't." The guards stepped forward. "Mr. Langston," one of them said flatly, "you don't live here anymore." And just like that, they grabbed him. Richard struggled, but the guards were stronger. They pulled him out of his bedroom, dragging him down the grand marble hallway that he had built, everything blurred, the crystal chandeliers, the designer furniture, the massive paintings worth more than most people's homes, all of it. And it was no longer his. "Let go of me," he barked, trying to yank his arms free. They didn't listen. They dragged him toward the massive double doors of the penthouse. His penthouse. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "You can't do this. I am Richard Langston." The lawyer sighed. "Not anymore." And then the doors opened, and they threw him out. Richard stumbled into the hallway, nearly falling to his knees. The doors slammed shut behind him, the finality of it ringing in his ears. He was outside his own home, wearing nothing but a robe, barefoot on the cold marble floors in the building he once owned. His breathing came fast and ragged. His hands shook as he turned, pounding on the door. "Let me back in." Silence. "Do you hear me? I own this place." More silence, and then his phone buzzed in his robe pocket. He snatched it out, gripping it with trembling fingers. The screen displayed a single text message from Victor. "Check your bank account." His fingers moved on instinct, opening his banking app. The screen loaded. His balance appeared. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His legs almost gave out beneath him. $0. Not millions, not billions, zero. He blinked, his mind refusing to process it. Then another text. "Game over." A lump formed in Richard's throat. It was gone. All of it, every penny, every investment, every offshore account, his entire empire. And then, like a final stab to the heart, his credit cards declined. One by one, notifications popped up. "Your transaction has been declined. Your card is no longer active. Your account has been suspended." Panic clawed at his chest. He was broke. He needed help. He needed to call someone, his friends. He scrolled through his contacts, his fingers moving too fast. Desperate. Jonathan, his business partner, his closest ally. He pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, voicemail. He tried another, and another. No one answered. One by one, the people who had once showered him with praise, who had fought to be in his circle, they all disappeared. His so-called friends, the people who had attended his lavish parties, toasted his success, laughed at his jokes, all gone, like cockroaches fleeing when the lights turned on. Richard Langston, once one of the richest men in America, now stood outside a building that no longer belonged to him. The New York skyline stretched before him, the streets buzzing with life, and for the first time in his existence, he had nowhere to go. No money, no home, no friends, no power. The world moved on around him, people rushing past, not sparing him a glance. And in that moment, Richard realized the cold, brutal truth. He wasn't special. He was nothing. Just another man on the street. And no one cared. Richard collapsed onto a bench, his hands gripping his hair. A broken, shattered man. For the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than fear. Regret. Real, soul-crushing regret. And the worst part? There was no way to fix it. No money, no power, no second chances. He had gambled everything. And now? He had lost. The bitter wind cut through Richard Langston's thin jacket as he trudged down a cracked sidewalk, his feet aching from miles of walking. Days had turned into weeks, and the weight of his new reality pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. Just weeks ago, he had been at the top of the world, a billionaire, a king among men. Now he was invisible. No more private jets, no more luxury penthouses, no more adoring crowds waiting to laugh at his jokes or hang on to his every word. Now he was nothing. He saw the world differently now. The people he once looked down on were his only company. He realized how cruel the world could be to those without money. He walked aimlessly through the crowded streets of New York, but no one saw him. The very same people who had once praised him, fought for his attention, worshipped his wealth. They now walked past without a second glance. He had been on the cover of Forbes. Now He was just another nameless face in a sea of the forgotten. His stomach twisted with hunger, a gnawing pain that refused to go away. It had been 2 days since he last ate. Desperation clawed at his pride as he eyed the scraps of food left on a diner's outdoor table. A half-eaten sandwich, a cold cup of coffee. His fingers twitched. Number even now, with nothing left, he still had his pride. Didn't he? His stomach growled in protest, and the thought of pride faded. He needed food. Richard's feet led him toward a long line stretching down the block, a soup kitchen. The smell of warm bread and broth filled the air, making his hunger even worse. He hesitated. This wasn't for people like him. He had once donated to charities like this, appearing in photos with smiling volunteers, shaking hands with the directors, signing checks that he never really cared about. But standing here, among the homeless, the forgotten, the struggling, he realized he was one of them now. The thought made him sick, but his hunger was worse. Swallowing the last shred of his dignity, he stepped into the line. The line moved slowly, and Richard stood shoulder to shoulder with people he had once ignored. A man with a scruffy beard and torn gloves stood in front of him, muttering to himself. A woman with sunken eyes held a child close, whispering soothing words as the little girl shivered in the cold. These were the kinds of people Richard had never spared a thought for, people who had always been beneath him. Now, they were his equals, maybe even better than him. A lump formed in his throat. For the first time, he understood. The line moved forward. A tired-looking volunteer handed him a tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. Richard hesitated before taking it. "Thank you," he murmured. The woman barely looked at him, already turning to the next person. To her, he was just another hungry mouth to feed, and that truth hurt more than anything. Richard sat at a plastic table, staring down at his food. A month ago, he had feasted on steaks, caviar, and the finest wines money could buy. Now, he was grateful for a bowl of thin soup and stale bread. He took a bite, swallowing past the lump in his throat. It was the most satisfying meal he had eaten in weeks, but it tasted nothing like the food he once had. It tasted like humility. First time here? Richard looked up. A man with graying hair, a tattered coat and kind eyes sat across from him, sipping his soup. Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." The man smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "It won't be your last." Richard frowned. "I won't be here long. He stopped himself. What was he about to say? That this wasn't his life? That he didn't belong here? That he was different? Because none of that was true anymore. The man chuckled, seeing through him. "I used to think that too," he said, breaking off a piece of bread. "I had a job, a home, a wife." His voice softened. "Lost it all." Richard swallowed. "What happened?" The man sighed. "Laid off, bills piled up, my wife left. Then one day I woke up and—" He gestured around them. "This became my life." Richard stared at him. The man had once had everything too, just like him, and yet here he was, accepting his fate. Richard gritted his teeth. "I'll get back on my feet," he said stubbornly. The man studied him for a long moment. "I hope you do," he said simply. "But if you don't, you're not alone." Richard didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, someone wasn't looking at him for what he had, just for who he was, and that realization left him more shaken than anything else. That night, Richard slept in a shelter. The mattress was thin, the blanket barely warm. The room smelled of sweat and exhaustion, filled with people who had lost their way, just like him. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he thought about Isabella. Had she found happiness without him? Had she moved on while he was falling apart? For the first time, he saw his past through her eyes. He had spent years believing that money made him powerful, that wealth gave him value, that as long as he was rich, people would love him. But now, lying on this cot with nothing left to his name, he understood the truth. He had never really been powerful. He had just been lucky, and he had thrown it all away. Richard turned onto his side, closing his eyes. For years he had built an empire, but what good was an empire when the foundation was rotten? He had lost everything. But maybe this was his chance to find something real, something money could never buy, something he had never truly had. A second chance. The shelter smelled of stale coffee, damp clothes, and quiet despair. Richard sat in a corner, huddled in a donated coat that was 2 sizes too big. The weight of his new reality pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. A month. It had been a full month since he had lost everything, his wealth, his empire, and worst of all, Isabella. Every day blurred into the next. Wake up, scavenge for food, search for a job, fail, return to the shelter, repeat. He had gone from owning the world to being invisible. But tonight would be different, because tonight he met Samuel. Richard noticed him while waiting in line for dinner, an elderly man with silver-streaked hair, wrapped in a tattered wool coat, sitting alone at a table. His hands were weathered and calloused, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. Too sharp for someone who had lived on the streets for years. Something about him felt different. Richard grabbed his tray, a bowl of watery stew and a slice of bread, then hesitated before sitting across from the man. Samuel didn't acknowledge him at first, just stirred his soup slowly, thoughtfully. Then, without looking up, he said, "You've got the look of a man who's just woken up in a nightmare." Richard stiffened. "Excuse me?" Now Samuel looked at him, really looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with the kind of knowing gaze that only came from someone who had seen the rise and fall of many men. Richard's stomach twisted, because that's exactly what had happened to him. "Let me guess," Samuel said, setting his spoon down. "You weren't always here." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "What gave it away?" Samuel smirked. "You sit different. You eat slow, like you're still expecting filet mignon instead of soup that tastes like cardboard." He paused. "And your hands, no scars, no dirt under the nails. You weren't born into this life. You fell into it." Richard stared at his own hands. He had once signed billion-dollar deals with these hands. Now they trembled from hunger. He exhaled shakily. "I was rich, powerful, had everything." His throat tightened, and I threw it away. Samuel nodded as if he already knew. "I was once like you," he said quietly. Richard blinked. "What?" Samuel smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I had money. I had power. But money is like sand. It slips through your fingers if you're not careful." He stirred his soup again, lost in thought. "And I was careless." Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "How did you lose it?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "My pride destroyed me," he admitted. "I thought I was untouchable. Made a bad investment, lost millions overnight. I should have stopped there, but I was desperate. Gambled the rest away, hoping I could win it back." He gave a wry chuckle. "I was wrong." Richard's stomach twisted, because Samuel's story wasn't just a story. It was a mirror. He had made the same mistake, the same arrogance, the same blind belief that he could never lose. And yet, here they both were, 2 broken men in a homeless shelter trying to piece together the wreckage of their lives. Samuel sighed, looking around the shelter. "You know the funny thing?" he mused. "I thought losing my fortune was the worst thing that could happen to me." He glanced back at Richard, his gaze piercing. "But I was wrong." Richard frowned. "What was the worst thing?" Samuel's jaw tightened. Losing myself. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Samuel leaned forward. Money comes and goes. But character, that's the only thing that really belongs to you. Richard swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life believing that money made him powerful, that it made him worthy. But what had it really given him? Fake friends, temporary happiness. And when it was gone, so was everyone who had pretended to love him. Samuel patted his shoulder. Listen, kid, you lost your money. That doesn't mean you have to lose who you are. Richard let out a bitter laugh. And who am I? Samuel studied him for a moment, then said something that made Richard's breath catch. That's up to you now. For the first time since losing everything, Richard didn't feel alone. Samuel wasn't just some homeless man. He was a lesson, a reminder that wealth wasn't everything, that pride destroyed more men than poverty ever could, that a man's true value wasn't in his bank account, but in his soul. And for the first time, Richard Langston listened, not as a billionaire, not as a man trying to reclaim his fortune, but as a broken soul searching for meaning. Maybe, just maybe, Samuel was right. Maybe losing everything wasn't the end. Maybe it was a beginning. The morning air was crisp, the city already awake with the sounds of honking cars, hurried footsteps and murmured conversations. Richard Langston stood outside a small cafe, rubbing his cold hands together. His first job in months. It wasn't much, just cleaning tables and wiping down counters, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't known since losing everything. Hope. He entered the cafe, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee wrapping around him like a warm embrace. The owner, a stout woman named Maria, glanced up from behind the counter. Her sharp eyes studied him. "You're late," she said, handing him a rag. Richard swallowed. "By 2 minutes." Maria raised an eyebrow. 2 minutes late is still late. Richard exhaled and nodded. "Won't happen again," she smirked. "Good. Now get to work." He turned toward the empty tables, rag in hand, a billionaire wiping tables. The irony stung. A month ago, he wouldn't have even noticed the man cleaning up after him in a restaurant. Now, he was that man. But instead of shame, he felt something surprising. Gratitude. Because for the first time in weeks, he had a purpose. Richard moved through the cafe, clearing plates, wiping tables, stacking chairs. Each dish he carried, each floor he swept, each coffee cup he rinsed, they all humbled him. He thought of the waiters he had snapped at in the past, the housekeepers he had ignored, the janitors who had been invisible to him. He had been cruel to people like this. And now he was one of them. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But maybe he needed the bitterness. Maybe this was his medicine. "Hey, you missed a spot." Richard turned to see a man in a tailored suit, the kind of man he used to be. The businessman smirked. "What, never done a real job before?" Richard clenched his jaw. His old self would have lashed out, put this man in his place with a single cutting remark. But that man was gone. Instead, Richard simply nodded. "You're right," he said calmly, wiping the spot. The businessman looked disappointed, as if he had expected a fight. He scoffed and walked away, but Richard didn't let it get to him. He had nothing to prove. For the first time in his life, he understood what dignity really meant. At the end of his shift, Maria placed a brown paper bag on the counter. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Lunch," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. He hesitated. Maria cut him off. "Don't argue with me. Just take it." Richard took the bag, warmth spreading through his chest. He had spent his whole life taking from people. Now he was learning what it meant to receive with grace. "Thank you," he murmured. Maria just waved him off. "Be on time tomorrow." A small smile tugged at Richard's lips as he stepped outside. Tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, he had something to look forward to. The cafe job led to more small tasks, carrying groceries for elderly women, helping a florist unload supplies, sweeping the sidewalk outside a bakery. Each job paid little, but Richard wasn't doing it for the money. He was doing it for himself. Every act of labor chipped away at his arrogance. Every thank you he received softened his heart. He was changing, not just on the outside, but deep within. That night, back at the shelter, Richard sat next to Samuel, the old man who had become his unexpected mentor. "You look different," Samuel noted. Richard smirked. "I cleaned tables today." Samuel chuckled. "Hard work suits you." Richard exhaled. "It's strange. A month ago, I would have laughed at the idea of doing any of this." Samuel nodded. "Because you thought money made you important." Richard looked down at his calloused hands. "I was wrong." Samuel smiled. "Good. That means you're learning." Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years chasing wealth, believing it would make him untouchable. Now he was learning that true strength didn't come from power. It came from humility, and for the first time, he felt truly free. Lying on his cot that night, Richard thought about the future. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't powerful, feared, or admired, but he was alive, and as long as he was alive, he had a chance to become someone better. For the first time in his life, hope wasn't tied to money. Hope was in his own hands, and he wasn't going to waste it. The nights at the shelter were always the same, cold air seeping through cracked windows, the quiet murmur of lost souls, and the distant hum of the city Richard once ruled. But something inside him had changed. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he could give. Richard sat at one of the long, dented metal tables in the shelter, watching a young mother struggle to calm her crying child. Her name was Elena. She had arrived a few days ago, carrying nothing but a torn backpack, a toddler, and a look of quiet desperation. Richard had seen that look before, in the mirror. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Need a hand?" Elena looked up, wary. "No offense," she said, bouncing the child on her hip. "But what can you do?" Richard smiled, a real one, not the cold, practiced smirk he used to wear in boardrooms. "I can listen." That was all it took. Elena sighed and sank onto the bench, exhaustion heavy in her shoulders. "I lost my job last month. Couldn't pay rent. Ended up here." Richard nodded. "What did you do before?" "Accounting assistant," she said, "but I never finished college." Richard's mind started working. He might not have money anymore, but he still had knowledge, and knowledge was something he could share. Word spread quickly in the shelter. The once arrogant billionaire who had hit rock bottom was now helping others find a way out. He started with Elena, guiding her through online job applications at the local library, helping her refine her resume. Then it was Jared, a former mechanic who had been laid off and needed help navigating unemployment benefits. Then Lisa, a young woman who had escaped an abusive home but had no idea how to start over. Before long, Richard wasn't just surviving, he was making a difference, and in helping them, he was healing himself. One evening, Richard sat with Samuel outside the shelter, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. "You're different," Samuel said, lighting a cigarette. Richard chuckled. "Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true." Samuel exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "You're not chasing money anymore." Richard looked at his hands, rougher now, calloused from real work. "I spent my whole life believing wealth was about power. Control." He turned to Samuel, realization burning in his chest. "But real wealth, it's in people. It's in what we give, not what we take." Samuel smirked. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Richard laughed, a deep, honest laugh. For the first time in his life, he truly understood. One morning, Maria, the cafe owner who had given Richard his first job, pulled him aside. "You ever think about managing a place like this?" she asked. Richard blinked. "You mean, like running it?" Maria crossed her arms. "I've been watching you. You're good with people, you work hard, and let's be real, you've got a business mind. You could help me expand." Richard hesitated. It wasn't a billion-dollar empire. It wasn't penthouses and private jets, but it was honest work, and more than that, it was a chance to build something real. "I'd love to," he finally said, meaning every word. Weeks turned into months. Richard became a familiar face in the neighborhood, not as a billionaire, but as a man who helped others rise. The cafe grew. Elena got a job. Jared found work as a mechanic again. Lisa enrolled in college. And Richard, he found purpose. Not in money, not in power, but in kindness. He had lost everything, and in doing so he had gained more than he ever thought possible. One afternoon, as Richard wiped down a cafe table, a customer walked in. He recognized the expensive shoes before he saw the man's face. Victor, the man who had taken everything from him. Victor froze when he saw Richard, eyes narrowing. "Richard Langston." Richard straightened, meeting Victor's gaze without fear, without anger. "Yes." Victor smirked, looking him up and down. "Didn't expect to see you here." Richard wiped his hands on his apron. "Didn't expect to be here." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn, from billionaire to, what, a waiter?" Richard smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "No," he said simply. "To a better man." Victor frowned, confused. "You don't miss it? The money, the power?" Richard thought about it. Then, with a certainty he had never known before, he shook his head. "I used to think I needed it, but now I know I don't." Victor scoffed. "Shame. You were a legend." Richard shrugged. "I still am, just in a different way." Victor left, muttering something under his breath. Richard just smiled. For the first time in his life, he was truly rich. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the bustling community event. Laughter and chatter filled the air as volunteers set up booths, handed out meals, and helped families in need. Richard Langston adjusted the stack of donated clothes he was carrying, wiping sweat from his brow. This had become his life now, giving, serving, rebuilding, and for the first time he was at peace. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. He heard her voice before he saw her. Software, warm, unmistakable. "Excuse me, could you help me with these boxes?" Richard turned, his breath catching in his throat. Isabella. She was standing a few feet away, sorting through donated supplies for the underprivileged families they were helping. Her hair, still as radiant as he remembered, was pulled into a loose ponytail. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, nothing extravagant, yet she looked more beautiful than ever. His heart pounded. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment he considered walking away. But then their eyes met. Richard felt the world slow. In her gaze he saw something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, but curiosity, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "Richard," she said softly. Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet surprise. He swallowed hard. "Isabella." She tilted her head, searching his face. The arrogance, the coldness. It was gone. Instead, she saw humility, growth, something she had always wished to see in him, but never had. "You've changed," she murmured. Richard let out a shaky breath. "I had to lose everything to see what truly mattered." A pause stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, with years of love and hurt tangled together. Then she did something he never expected. She smiled. They moved to a quieter corner of the park, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. For the first time since the night of the reckless bet, they talked. Not as a billionaire and his trophy wife, not as a man who had everything and a woman who had been discarded like an object, but as two people, two souls with wounds, two hearts that had once been broken. "I hated you for what you did," Isabella admitted, fingers twisting in her lap. Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I hated me too." She looked at him, her brown eyes searching. "Then why did you do it?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was a fool. I thought wealth made me invincible. That love, that you, were just another thing I owned." Her breath hitched. "And now?" He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Now, I know that losing you was the greatest mistake of my life." She blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from pain, but from the sheer, aching truth of his words. Richard had spent months apologizing in his own way, not with words, but with actions. He had humbled himself. He had learned to serve, to listen, to care, not for personal gain, but because it was right. And Isabella could see it. "I never thought I'd see you like this," she whispered. Richard smiled sadly. "Neither did I." Silence. Then softly she asked, "Do you regret it?" He didn't hesitate. "No." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "If I hadn't lost everything," he explained, "I would have never realized how empty I was, how much I took you for granted, how much I needed to change." She studied him, something tender breaking through the last of her defenses. He had lost his wealth, but in losing it, he had found something greater, and she saw it now. The event continued around them, children laughing, volunteers working, the sun dipping lower in the sky. But for Richard and Isabella, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly. They reminisced about the good times. They mourned the bad. And in that quiet space between them, something fragile and beautiful began to bloom again. A second chance, not built on wealth or power, but on understanding, on growth, on love. As the event wrapped up, Isabella stood dusting off her jeans. Richard followed, unsure of what to say. Did he ask for another chance? Did he let her go, knowing she was better off without him? Before he could decide, she turned to him. "Walk me home?" she asked. His heart swelled. Not a declaration of love, not a promise of a future, just a small step, an invitation, a chance to rewrite their story, one honest moment at a time. Richard smiled. "I'd love to." And as they walked side by side, beneath the soft glow of streetlights, he realized something. This, not money, not power, not status, this was true wealth. And he would never gamble it away again. Richard knew words weren't enough. He had already lost everything once, his fortune, his power, his status. But losing Isabella had been the deepest cut of all. And if he wanted a second chance, he couldn't just say he had changed. He had to prove it, not with grand gestures, not with empty promises, but with actions. The first few weeks after reuniting with Isabella were delicate, like walking on glass. She was warm but guarded, kind but distant. She laughed at his jokes, but her eyes still held the weight of old wounds. Richard understood. He had betrayed her in the worst way, not with another woman, but with his arrogance, with his belief that she was just another possession. That kind of pain doesn't heal overnight. And he didn't expect it to, so instead of chasing her, instead of trying to force something, he did what he should have done years ago. He listened, not to answer, not to defend himself, just to understand. Richard threw himself into his work, not the kind he used to do, but the kind that actually mattered. He began volunteering full-time, not just at the shelter, but in the very communities his business had once ignored. He met single mothers struggling to find work. He met young black entrepreneurs who had been denied funding simply because of their skin color. He met immigrants working 3 jobs, barely surviving because the system was stacked against them. And Richard, the man who once only saw the world through the lens of profit and loss, finally saw reality. a system that thrived on keeping certain people down, a society that valued wealth over humanity, and for the first time, he knew he had the power to change it, not with money, with action. Richard poured every ounce of energy into something new, the Langston Initiative. It wasn't just another charity, it was a movement, a foundation dedicated to racial equality and economic justice, things he had once ignored in his pursuit of power. He secured funding for minority-owned businesses. He created job training programs for the homeless and formerly incarcerated. He partnered with legal teams to help victims of unfair housing discrimination. Every single thing he did was designed to uplift the very people he had once disregarded. And slowly, the world started to notice. But more importantly, Isabella noticed. One evening, Richard was speaking at a community event about equal opportunities in business. As he stepped down from the podium, he spotted Isabella in the crowd. Richard Langston had changed, not just in the way he spoke or the way he carried himself, but in his soul. The man who once threw away his wife and fortune in a reckless bet was gone, and in his place stood someone new, a man who no longer craved power, a man who had learned the true value of integrity, humility, and love. But fate had one final test for him. One evening, after wrapping up a community fundraiser, Richard received an unexpected message, an invitation, the location, a high-end casino in Las Vegas, the sender, Victor, the same man who had taken everything from him, the same man who had watched him fall without a shred of pity. Curious, Richard made the journey, not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted closure. Victor sat in a private lounge, sipping whiskey, his signature smirk plastered across his face. Despite the time that had passed, he was still the same, ruthless, cunning, and completely untouched by guilt. "Well, well," Victor drawled as Richard stepped inside. "I heard you've been keeping yourself busy." Richard remained calm. "You heard right." Victor leaned forward, amusement dancing in his cold eyes. "Imagine my surprise when I learned that Richard Langston, the man who once ruled the world, was now spending his days playing charity worker." Richard didn't react. "Is that why you called me here?" Victor chuckled, swirling his drink. "Not exactly." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected, a contract, one that looked eerily similar to the one Richard had foolishly signed the night he lost everything. Victor laid the contract on the table and slid it toward Richard. "A once-in-a-lifetime offer," Victor said smoothly. "One last gamble." Richard didn't touch the paper. "For what?" Victor's smirk widened. "Everything you lost. His old empire, his fortune, his power, all of it. One final bet." "I'm giving you a chance to win it all back," Victor continued. "One game, one moment, and just like that, you'll be restored." He sat back, waiting for Richard to take the bait, waiting for him to fall into the same trap. But Richard only smiled. Slowly, Richard picked up the contract. He studied it, not with hunger, not with desperation, but with clarity. Then, to Victor's shock, he ripped it in half. The pieces fluttered to the table like fallen leaves. Victor's smirk vanished. Richard met his stunned gaze and said, "Some things should never be gambled, Victor. I learned that the hard way." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Victor had no words, no smirk, no comeback, just a blank, stunned expression, as he realized that Richard Langston, the man he had once destroyed, was no longer the same. Richard had won, not by playing Victor's game, but by walking away from it. Richard left the casino that night with nothing in his pockets, no wealth, no billion-dollar empire, but for the first time in his life, he felt richer than ever. He didn't need his old fortune. He had something better, a new purpose, a new heart, a new beginning. And when he returned home, Isabella was waiting for him, not because of money, not because of power, but because he had finally become the man she always believed he could be. The city pulsed with life around them. Cars honked, streetlights flickered, laughter echoed from a nearby cafe. Richard and Isabella walked side by side, their steps unhurried, their hands brushing against each other. It felt so simple, so natural, and yet for Richard it was everything. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't walking above the world, he was walking with it. As they strolled through the streets, Richard took it all in. The rich dining in high-rise restaurants, the homeless man curled up under a bridge, the young couple laughing over street food. He saw life in all its forms. Not just numbers, not just investments, not just assets. People. Each one with a story, each one carrying dreams, fears, struggles. And for the first time, he understood them. Really understood them. He used to believe money was the ultimate power, that wealth could shield him from pain, that status could define his worth. But now he knew the truth. None of it meant anything without love, without purpose, without humanity. Isabella walked beside him, quiet but content. Then softly she said, "This is the Richard I always loved." He turned to her, heart pounding. She met his gaze. "Not the billionaire," she continued, "but the man who finally understands love." Richard swallowed hard. There were no grand speeches left to make, no promises to give, because for once his actions had spoken for him. He didn't need to buy her back. He didn't need to convince her. She saw him, the real him, and that was enough. Richard reached for her hand, not with desperation, not with fear, but with something real, and this time she held on, firm, steady, sure. He had lost everything, his empire, his fortune, his name, but in the end he had gained something greater, his soul, his humanity, and most importantly, her. Richard Langston was no longer the man he used to be. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire who believed money could solve everything. He had once gambled away his empire, his fortune, and his marriage, believing that power made him untouchable. But through his fall, he had discovered something greater, something that money could never buy, a purpose, a mission, a reason to make his second chance mean something. Richard knew that the world was full of people who had been cast aside, people who, like him, had once been judged for what they had, or didn't have. The poor, the overlooked, the ones society ignored because they didn't fit into the world of wealth and privilege. So he made a vow. He would not return to his old life. Instead, he would use his past mistakes to build something new, something that mattered. He spoke out against the classism that had once blinded him. He stood up against the racism that he had once ignored. He fought for the people he had once dismissed. And for the first time, the world listened. With Isabella by his side, Richard used his knowledge not for profit, but for change. He created programs that helped struggling families find jobs, education, and stability. He opened shelters for those without homes, providing not just food, but dignity. He invested in schools in underserved communities, ensuring that every child, no matter their background, had a future. And he made it his mission to tear down the walls that divided people by race and class. He held speeches, he met with leaders, he marched in protests, not as a billionaire, not as a former tycoon, but as a man who had learned the hard way what truly mattered in life. One evening, Richard stood before a packed audience at a global conference. Every seat was filled. People from every background, rich, poor, privileged, oppressed, sat in silence waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath and said the words that had become the foundation of his new life. Money can buy power, but it cannot buy love, respect, or true worth. The room was silent. Every ear listened. Every heart absorbed his words. Richard continued, his voice steady and filled with the wisdom of his journey. Wealth does not define a person. Status does not make someone superior. The real value of a person lies in their kindness, their humanity, and the way they treat others. He looked across the room, meeting the eyes of young dreamers, struggling workers, billionaires, and world leaders alike. I once believed that money made me invincible. I was wrong. It took losing everything for me to see the truth. He smiled, not with arrogance, but with understanding. If we want a better world, we must stop measuring people by their bank accounts and start measuring them by their hearts. The crowd erupted in applause. Tears were shed. Lives were changed. Because in that moment, they saw it too. The truth Richard had fought so hard to learn. The lesson that had cost him everything, only to give him something far greater in return. Richard Langston had lost his empire, but he had built something stronger, a movement, a message, a legacy. And he had done it not by chasing power, but by choosing love, by choosing people, by choosing humanity. And in the end, the billionaire who had lost everything became the man who truly gained the world.